So we have a couple of, I think, interesting presentations through as it comes up. Sales enablement, I started a lot of this work before even this word got coined together in the industry. I think many of you have been in that sort of position. It's an adjacency of mine, but I thought I would come and present here on something that, our organization struggled through a little bit, was challenged, and I think I've heard enough people also empathize with this approach. So hopefully, let's get into it. So I work for a company called National Instruments. We make physical testing devices just so that you have a background of the type of company and the type of customers we deal with. So anything from your cell phones to autonomous cars to a pacemaker, we test those sort of things. So we're dealing with engineers and others on the other side. So historically, our sales force has been engineers, talking to engineers. But over time, your platform grows, your value grows, you're now selling to the VP of engineering, the VP of manufacturing, a very product-centric culture, right? Now you're trying to move them into business value. I think this is a fairly common thing for a lot of product companies as they move up in the value chain. And the question is, how can you take your whole sales force, or if not your entire sales force, at least the top of the triangle sales force into that domain? And then hopefully as you mature that, how do you push it down? So this is more of a journey really of the top of the triangle. What challenges did we face? How did we go through it? And a lot of this, over time I discovered is pretty scalable to other companies. So actually, Gartner wrote up on that as a best-in-class kind of an approach. So a lot of the slides, I give them credit because they were much better at putting my slides together than what I could. So let's jump into it and see if we can make this interesting. Okay, there's a clicker somewhere. Okay, so just quick thing on myself. I've done product management, I've done product marketing, which is happening in the room next door. I've done sales enablement here. Also done services, which often follows, your product sales. So a little bit of everything, which often allows me to think a little harder of what is the customer thinking. The customer, the buying part of it is a very small part of the life cycle of what a customer goes through. They're in the business of solving business problems, all the way from how do I even get my company to pay attention to this problem? How do I even get funding for this problem? Who's on my team who's going to solve it? How do I solve it? Along this whole journey, there's a small slice. Oh, I got to buy some products and services. So if you put yourself in their shoes, you realize how much risk and how much understanding of their world you need to have. And as sellers, our team was trying to gravitate towards that, especially the top of the triangle where everybody says you want to become a trusted advisor to your customers, you want to sell based on business value on top of product value. Everybody at that level assumes that your product does good things, otherwise you wouldn't be here. So this is the journey of that. So let me dive into that a little bit. So the first thing we did was we got our senior sellers together with sales management and sponsored by our VP of sales and said, what are you guys struggling with? Right? Before I spend any time creating content or any framework, get the senior leaders together. And also I realized the senior leaders have a different view of the problem than the actual sellers on the front line. So you need to have a realistic combination of both of them in the room to kind of say, where are you struggling with? So again, I'm talking on the top of the triangle, which means they're going after a very select set of accounts. Many companies call them by different names. It's strategic account management program, key account management programs, and so on. By the way, just interesting, by a show of hands, how many of you guys have something like that? A key account program or SAM or GAM or something like that? So most companies, as they mature along the way, they realize they need to segment your customers into different places. So it's a natural evolution. So we had the rest of it reasonably covered. What we were struggling with was the top of the triangle. So the first thing they said was, Well, these are massive accounts and massive enterprises I'm going after. Where do I start? There are a multitude of places and multitude of our products fit into this world. How do I figure out what's the best place to start? The second question they asked after that was, okay, now assume I somehow figured out I'm going after this division of the company. How do I understand the customer's business challenges in those areas? I'm looking at the company from the outside in, and my knowledge is somewhat limited by my previous touch points of what I've seen at other companies. But that was the second fundamental reason was I need to be selling based on business value, so I need to understand their business challenges. Then the third thing they said was, well, after I understand that, what am I going to do about it? Right? So the third part of it was, what insights or what do I bring to the table? Somebody else had said, it's all about bringing insights to the table, telling the customer something they don't already know. All that world, how do I bring that to the table? So it doesn't say that there are not other problems, but these were the top three that they put on the table and said, help us move through this. So essentially, the visualization is something that Gardner put together, which is sort of fairly simple, but, they were having difficulty in those levels. And the question was, what can you do about it? So the rest of my presentation is going to be around what we did around these three things. And they're fairly generic things, and I think they apply pretty much to most companies that you kind of go through it in some way. So we built three sets of capabilities to support these three things. And I'll talk of each one a little more in detail. So for the first part, we created something called mental maps, which allowed the sales organization to figure out what's the best place to hunt. The second thing we said was, how do you understand your customers better? It was all around building a business impact hypothesis. And how do you actually test it with the customer, and how do you actually get the customer to participate with you in that? And then the third part was, what insight or what values do you bring? And that's where we created our business insight playbooks. So a little bit of how do we actually do this? How did we do it? What were the ways to do it? And also some structures that I think I find, others find useful in it is how to lay these things out inside your own organization. So let's start with the first one. Companies have big goals. So here, I'm going to just go through these in some sort of realistic, simplified examples that's easier to understand. So here is a customer who wants to improve their phone sales, right? It's a very big, ambitious, generic goal. Your seller might be moving into the same account, my seller might be moving into the same space, and figuring out, how do I help this company? And there are, a handful of these in the whole world. So what we try to help them through is a mental map of breaking them down into, okay, what is going to drive that? Figure out with the customer or your best estimate. Here I'm doing very simplified thing. To improve sales, I might produce a high quality product at a much lower price point. It's just one strategy. Might be the opposite of what Apple is doing, but it's a strategy of one of the companies in there. So once you have some idea, and again, a lot of these, you have to go in. You can't keep asking the customer for all these. You have to go in with some pre-built mental models of how you think a customer works, and they will eagerly correct you. They will say, okay, you forgot something here. If you go with a clean sheet of paper and say, help me put this together, that's not what the customer's job is to do. And then you break it down one more level, right? You say, okay, what drives quality? And I'm just putting up some things just from my own words to say, okay, you should be improving your testing efficiency. You can design it better so that the quality is there. The cost has different components, capital costs, there's operational costs, other types of costs. So somewhere in there, what we found is by the second or third level, we would have found something in here that we think we can help them with. There's lots of things in there that my organization has no competency to help them with. And sometimes it's good referral, even as a trusted advisor, to say, actually for that, you're better off going and talking to somebody else in the space. So this sort of, and over time we built just a handful of these things. They were just starting discussions on different aspects. It was tremendously useful for our sales force to have a starting point like this, rather than sit on their own and figure out, oh, what will this customer like, or where should I start this conversation with? So again, the summary of it was, if you start from the right to the left, it ensures that the seller and the customer are aligned. One of the things we find is customers are no different than myself or even my sellers is they see some symptom and then they jump to a solution and they just want you, they're just telling you, help me figure out how to create a solution. And if we don't do this due diligence, we've had some really big deals go fall apart later on, where the customer essentially, it's a no decision because they didn't take into consideration a lot of the other things that should have been looked at before. It takes a bit of confidence to actually, what we do this is we slow the customer down. And we ask very gently, when I talk to other customers, when they're doing this phase, they usually have answered these set of questions. Have you guys figured it out? And then you get the reaction, oh no, actually, two of these questions we've never talked about, but it's good that you bring it up. Maybe we should stop and figure that out before we do that. So part of it is this very collaborative. They're looking at you. They don't make these sort of decisions. They make a decision like this maybe once in 5 years. You as a seller, they're looking at it and say, you talk to customers every day. Somebody or the other is going through this. Bring that institutional knowledge to me so that I don't make the same mistakes, or help me accelerate this whole process in there. So the second part of it, it aids the seller to figure out the opportunities. And again, you saw in that bigger picture, there were many things that they could have focused on. But they very quickly found through this process the one or two things that are aligned with your company that you can potentially then go detail on. And the last thing you note in there, and this is what Gartner actually pointed out, in this role where you're playing, you are an independent consultant. So we don't talk about our products at this point in time at all. It'll color it, because immediately they'll make a connection. Oh, you're just trying to sell me something with this convoluted way of talking to me. So to hold your ground, and this is where we have to train our sellers, is people are not just going to accept it. They're going to push back. They're going to ask some questions. And whether you can hold your conversation up at that business level, or you very quickly then under pressure fall back to your product differentiation kind of things. So that is why we have to build the confidence in our sales force and other things to do that. But this was very important because, as somebody else said before, maybe you're not fit today for some reason. You're going to be a fit 6 months down the road because they have another project coming, but you build this trust that I am looking out for you. I'm thinking about things from your shoes. And I was a customer for a long time. I found very few sellers who would make that much effort to understand from my shoes, how am I looking at it? Most people will provide you with information and leave the risk-reward analysis up to the customer to figure out. The moment I see somebody doing this, I know he's on my side. It's literally, I can get my sales guy sitting with the buyer on the same side of the table, looking at the same screen and figuring out what is it we need to do together. So everybody talks about trust. These are the small steps towards building trust. Trust is something that you acquire over time. You can't demand it. You can't ask for it. So the second part of what they did was, our sellers would do is, okay, they would key out one of these areas, right? So now I found a space where both the customer and your company are interested in solving. And we had built a set of what we would call business hypotheses around this. So if you're interested in improving your operational costs or whatever be it for you, here are what we have seen other companies do. I'm still not talking anything about my product yet. I am bringing in best practices of what I have seen other companies do in this space. So I'm still building credibility. And the customer often has not done enough of these things that they're hungry for this. It's not only what are the best practices, but what are also the biggest mistakes. People are more, you can get people to act more on fear than on the positive aspect of it, right? So all of us, our product can do all these improvements for you, but it's often the reverse. What is the risk? how can you help me mitigate the risk inside my organization? Because that project this person is leading, if it goes down, his career goes down or something else goes down with him, right? So they are more interested in balancing the risk with the reward. The reward, everybody has ROI calculators and all sorts of very nice tools to show value. But very few companies spend enough time in helping de-risk the decision and the approach that you're taking with them. So we had for us, as I said, our typical groups that we would go after was engineering and production. So whether it's head of VP of manufacturing, VP of engineering, for you it might be VP of sales, VP of IT, or whoever it is. And for each of these, we built fairly simple things in there. What's the scenario? What is the business impact? Understand the consequence of that scenario first before you try to solve anything on it. Like, what metrics would have been affected? That is getting visibility higher up in their organization. Is it a cost-based metric that is getting, is it a revenue-based metric? Is it a quality-based metric? Is it some legal thing that they're getting into? So this allowed our sellers to kind of essentially identify the solution. And I'll talk about what is next coming is a series of playbooks. So this is a matching between the customer situation and some of the playbooks that we have. And originally, we didn't build these things. In fact, we built it the reverse. We built the playbooks first. And we thought that was great. That's what the customer needs as well as the sellers need. But we found this translation going from where the customer is to the value creation that you can provide was one of the biggest gaps that we had underestimated along the way that we built up. So the last part of what we did was we provided customer improvement playbooks. And again, we spent a lot of time. We crowdsourced most of these things. So first of all, we crowdsourced what are the most common problems your customers at these senior levels face. And we had, I think, a list of about 105 ideas or problems that they. So this team, I took a team, this fairly streamlined team I took 5 of our best sellers across. In this case, we did it in the Americas. So each region, we said, give me one of your best guys who understands this, has been doing it. And I took 2 people from my team, just a team of 7 people. Nobody had, everybody was volunteering to do this thing. And you see the passion in people come through and when they're really interested in doing things. So we used that and we basically said, go back into our sales organizations and find out what are the most common problems. We took those 100 plus, we streamlined those back into about 10. I said, that's a max 5 for one of the personas, which is engineering, 1 for production. So there's really 5 things that you can bring to the table. And for each of them, we basically, so you saw the scenario on the top. Then the question becomes, okay, if this is your situation, what is the business insight you're bringing? What would cause them to change from the status quo approach? I'm always fighting status quo, which is the risk-averse position that all these companies have. Nobody's blaming me for the status quo solution. Everybody wants to improve it. But if I change it, here are all the risks I see with it. So that's the business insight. You can bring great ideas. The first question you'll get is, who's done this before? Where have you seen it before? Either you or somebody else. So come with your proof points. They're usually business case studies as opposed to technology case studies. Somebody who's kind of done a problem of the scale that you're talking about. This is the third thing. When we crowdsource our sales guys, this is one of the things they brought to the table is nobody gives us these things. What are the most common objections? Nobody's going to basically say, okay, this is some great ideas, let's just go do. There's an immediate reaction from a customer, oh, I'm special. I'm separate. What are you telling me? There's something unique to my organization. This will never work. This is this and this. So those were what are the most common objections that you're going to run into. And this business case for change is something that, having run a business consulting team, very early on, we would want to figure out at a high level later on, how am I going to create a business case? And the reason for this is often in these larger enterprise organization sales, the investment needs to go into one group or one function, and the benefit is going to show up in another group, another function. So there is no vertical functional ROI. The ROI is across a larger part of the organization. So very early on, you're trying to seed in there is what level of management will be able to buy off on something like that and be able to bring the organization together. And then the last two are more of, why do you want to work with us? And a lot of it, you're already setting the stage. We are really interested in helping you be successful. What are the qualities? And this is where a soft pedal of how your platform potentially differentiates from the other one just comes in. Then the last thing we saw our sales guys missing was they would have these fantastic meetings, but not come out of it very clear actions. What is going to be the next important step that we're going to do together? So we actually had a very standardized set of expectations that they were set, and we actually set them up at two levels. If this kind of flow is going really well, there's an aggressive ask. And if it is not quite there, there is an average ask. But every one of them has an ask to move it forward to the next level, and we had some things around it. So this was basically the structure, and a structure around how a sales guy holds a conversation. It follows exactly, how they would be talking about it, and the sections kind of fall in place around it. We don't try to sell our products or our platform very strongly, even at this stage. We provide a link to the next steps. And this is something that Gardner pointed out. So when we built this, and we did it in less than a quarter, with borrowed people's time. We kicked it off in our SKO. But at the end of the day, it's still something static on a piece of paper. Yes, it has a lot of things in it. And one of the things sales guys said, don't give me anything more than a page because I will not have the time to look at it. So as some writer said, if I had a lot of time, I would have written a shorter letter to you. It takes a lot of skill and energy to put everything succinctly in one page. I've got other playbooks which are 24 pages long, covers every scenario, and no sales guy ever reads it. So this is the balance between the brevity of what is needed, as somebody had earlier said, and the impact that you're going to have in there. The role plays we did, we essentially took each one of these playbooks. Once a month, we would do a webcast. You would actually have a seller and his manager playing the role of the customer. And we made them become more demanding than even an average customer would be. So these conversations never went as beautifully as this playbook looks like, but it has the basic elements in there. And we did a webcast because we have over 1,000 sellers, but at the top of the triangle, sellers, about 50 of them. But in spite of it being inconvenient to them, they would all show up. So it was interactive. We would stop at discrete points and say, okay, given the information up to the stage, what would you have done? What question would you have asked, or what it is? So it was, and these are smart guys, so it is like a collection of ideas, and it would be, it was crowdsourcing, but it was also peer-to-peer interaction. So we were more of facilitation of that sort of thing. And then we would close it out, and we would do a recap. And then we set the goal that try it out for the next month. And we had our VP of sales personally interested in all of these, and we had an internal place where they could post a little bit of it. And he would come and commend it. If it didn't work, it was still okay because you built a relationship that you can come back into. Then the question was, why didn't it exactly work, and what did he accomplish in there? Where it worked, it was great. Some of the sellers would come in, I got asked these two other questions that weren't in my list. And now we had a trailing list of additional questions. So it matured over time, and the seller started owning it as opposed to somebody outside trying to provide it to them. So, everybody asks in the end, okay, what did this do for you and all that? It takes time. Our enterprise deals take 12 to 18 months to close. right? So revenue is always a trailing indicator. What we were looking much more was, were we expanding the pipeline and were we expanding the quality of the pipeline? And that is your first indicator. And yes, it's still subjective. You're not the only person who affected that pipeline. As somebody said, causation and correlation, but at least the correlation should be in the right direction. And since this was being led by sales teams and all that, we had, anecdotal things. We had lots of discussions around this thing. So it was, sales felt they owned the whole thing with other people supporting it, whereas often they have a sense that they're not in control. Everybody else is trying to give them stuff that doesn't quite interact with them. So again, this was nice to have, but I think overall it is this, we had a theme. We said this is for sales by sales. And it had the spirit of that all the way through. And I think that is what got adoption of it. I was reading somewhere like the industry average for sales playbooks is 29% adoption, and the best in class is 42%. And we got somewhere around 70% adoption for some of these things. So again, not saying something magic happened, but involving your salespeople along the way and keeping them involved in a way that they feel valued as part of it, and they feel that at the end they're going to get something they will actually use and be more practical about it, I think was the biggest message that we took away from it. So I think that is where I wanted to end and open up for some questions. And again, just as a summary, those are the three things we ended up building. But I would be curious, a lot of you have similar programs and other things, because I'm trying to learn as much as you guys are from this, What resources do you normally provide them, and what challenges have you seen that your strategic account or your senior sellers have with this sort of content? Or any other question you guys might have. Yeah. Yeah, I think there were relationship sellers, but I think for some of you who've read The Challenge of Sale and other ones in there, the world is changing. Our customers were changing. Where that was sufficient in the past, it wasn't enough in the current setting. So we essentially, not everybody's going to follow them, but we had a lot of more enthusiastic sellers who were willing to try this out. There's risk in them, right? So one of the biggest things was, these are my top accounts, even for the company, and my top sellers. So if we miss something, if we mess up something in here, it has repercussions, right? So the risk aversiveness was in there. But I think a lot of them realized that, adding the business value on top of the relationship is probably the perfect thing to expand the sale. It's very hard if you don't have any relationship just to walk in with something like this, right? So if I'm the customer sitting there, I look at it, one of the first questions I typically ask when somebody's trying to sell into my organization is, where have you added value inside my organization, so that I have some understanding of the credibility you bring to the table. So it was very rare that we would just walk in with completely no relationships, but it is taking those light relationships and then expanding them into that level. But that's a natural friction point for a lot of the traditional sellers in the space. Other thoughts? So again, for us, often this sector is your highest growth part of your portfolio, and often gets a lot of visibility from sales management. So interestingly, a lot of these discussions was get your sales management aligned with it. That wasn't as much of a challenge for us here because we got that, but the risk was higher, right? You have very high visibility now into everything you're doing. We used a very iterative process. So we would do things, I ran, as the backdrop to this, I also ran our strategic account program. So I had a portfolio of accounts where we could try out these things, right? So we would run a series of accounts through similar phases. We would get all the account leaders together and essentially say what worked, what didn't work. Of all this content for next year's teams, what would you throw out and what would you add back? So it took us about 2 to 3 cycles of it before everything stabilized. So I can't say that this was perfect day one out, but that's the sort of philosophy we used in our way of trying to reach this level. Any other question? Yeah. That is very helpful. Yeah, over time we've added that. We needed to start from the business impact because that we could scale across anybody I'm talking to. The personal impact requires a relationship understanding of what motivates this guy. Yeah. The other thing is, for those who've read The Challenge of Sale, as you get into these, this is all group decision making. There are whatever it is, 5.4, 6.8, some massive number of groups that you need to bring together. So then the individual relationship is great, but at that point, I need to build collective relationship with the team, right? So to us, that was the bigger challenge. And again, from our experience, when we were going in there, I have like 3 typical classes of customer personas who have very differing opinions about how to solve this problem. So I typically have the group I'm selling into, which is what I would call the doers. They do the work and all of it. There's another group inside the organization who's going to consume that, right? So for us, if we build a tester, there's some factory somewhere in the world who's going to consume that, who has a different perspective of what is it that they need. And then the third group is the funders, the people who pay money on the front end, right? So this is product management, program management, somebody like that. Each of them has a different metric, if you look across, and each of them has a different risk-reward sort of perspective in there. So our biggest challenge going into these larger things is how do I get, even if it's the same company, they may all agree generically, but how do I get these 3 groups to talk to each other and build a consensus? Otherwise, our default is a lot of discussion. In the end, it's, the customer didn't make a decision or they bought a very low-end sort of cop-out kind of a thing. So we found those sort of skill sets were where we needed to go into. We would do actually workshops where we would bring in these sort of groups and acknowledge that fundamentally you have different metrics. I'm not trying to compete against that. I'm trying to figure out what is a company level goal that all 3 of you are trying to achieve and how do we help you build against that. So a lot of this was great learning journey for us as an organization. And then what we've taken over time is taken this and then kind of created more filtered, simplified content for the rest of the triangle, right? So even if you're not at the top of the triangle account, these concepts apply. So we put that into our sales process. It's in other things. We put short videos of how to do these sort of things. So it's sort of filtering through the rest of the organization over time. So that's not locked at the top of the triangle. So I think that's where we saw the value of trying to do these things is kind of start moving your entire sales channel into a much more customer-centric viewpoint of the world, but also empowering them to actually do it as opposed to, we've always told our sellers, go sell at the high level, go sell at the business value, but not given them enough tools and confidence to do it. So this is the biggest thing I saw in them was their confidence went up significantly. And they have to experience each one of these things by themselves. Once they do the first one and they see the traction that they're getting, then it builds on themselves. So with that, let me end on time. And thanks for the opportunity of speaking to you guys.